So welcome back to the Strength Culture YouTube channel. Today's video is actually a little bit different. We've taken a 30-minute piece of one of the modules from our coach development program, which is an online mentorship that we have set up here through Melbourne Strength Culture. We initially were running an in-house internship. However, the popularity of it and also just the desire to help more coaches in their development of their careers as strength coaches meant that we have now taken it online, and we've just completed our first intake, and we've actually opened up our second intake, which will be commencing on August 17th. For more information, you can find it in the first link in the bio. However, today's video is actually the second part of a two-part series on breathing. Part one being respiratory physiology and anatomy, with part two being the mechanics of breathing, so how the actual system works and how it may influence some of the other structures of the body. We say that breathing is the portal to the nervous system for us as humans, so understanding breathing can be an incredibly important thing to understand for making changes to the human system as a whole. If you enjoy this content, we have 36 modules within our online program. So if you're interested in more information, again, go through the bio, go through the link in the bio. You can speak to me specifically if you like by filling out the form at the bottom of the information page, or just send me a DM or an email or anything like that. Again, we hope you enjoy this content, and thank you. We will be discussing respiratory mechanics today. So this is part two of last week's video regarding the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. Today we're talking about the actual mechanics. How the fuck does this thing work? And as I said last time, this is my favorite topic. I love understanding respiration and what is occurring. It's really, really cool, really, really interesting to me. So if I start ranting, I do apologize. The module outline. So what are we discussing today? We have Boyle's law and pressure gradient. So we need to understand some mechanical sort of engineering sort of science, I guess. We have ribcage mechanics. So how does this thing actually move and function? Luckily, I spent too much money on this little guy here, so we can actually show you. What I will do is I'll expand my bubble when I'm showing you those sort of things. We have to understand the structure, the pump and the bucket handle action. Then we have to understand diaphragm function, specifically how that sucker actually works. Also, this concept of accessory breathing muscles. I'm going to put a little thing here because, as we'll unpack, I don't really think you can classify them as accessory. They are just breathing muscles as well. Then we have inhalation and exhalation biased positions, and a little bit more of an understanding, a little bit more of exposure of the tensegrity model in terms of human movement there as well. So, as I discussed, there are some engineering, mechanical sort of definitions and concepts that we have to understand. The first one is Boyle's law. Boyle's law states that with a constant temperature, so when temperature doesn't change, the pressure of a system is inversely related to the volume of what's in there. So volume and pressure are inversely related. When pressure is up, generally that means volume will be down, and the vice versa. When pressure is down, volume is generally greater, and that can be seen here, that within this closed container, if we press down and decrease the volume, we are increasing the pressure inside of there. Those bubbles and movements are going to be occurring at a faster rate than if we open up the system and increase the volume, So the way that looks here, with respect to the diaphragm, pretend that this is a closed space, or the closed ventral cavity. We've closed the glottis off. And we have the diaphragm in below here. This would be the thoracic cavity above the diaphragm. This would be the abdominal cavity below the diaphragm. When the diaphragm has ascended, it's made the area above the level of the diaphragm smaller. It's decreased the volume, which means we would have increased the pressure. And then we actually get the flippy-floppy effect occurring underneath it, being that the area below the level of the diaphragm has actually gotten greater, which means the pressure has decreased. In the transition phase of the diaphragm beginning to descend, we will get some snapshot moment where we have the same pressure above and below the level of the diaphragm before the diaphragm begins to descend further, and then the pressure will flip. Where above the level of the diaphragm, because the space is now greater, we get a decrease in pressure. Where below the level of the diaphragm, we now have a closed off space, which means that the pressure has increased. And this is actually what part of the intra-abdominal pressure mechanism is. And that is the descension of the diaphragm to close that space. So we actually, in order to understand breathing and the mechanism of breathing, we need to throw in atmospheric pressure, which is the pressure of everything that is occurring to us at sea level. And that's the one thing that we need to understand. But the reason being is that gas and liquids moves from pressure gradients of high towards low pressure gradients. And the easiest way to understand this would be a dam. If I had a dam wall here, on this side where all the water is, it's in a high pressure situation. All of that water and the river system and canal system is pressing into this dam wall and creating a high pressure system. On the other side of the dam, where there is no pressure, because the wall has stopped it, that is a low pressure system. And when you remove this dam wall, all of the high pressure water flows into the low pressure system of the river system below. And that's how a dam works. But that's also how the breathing mechanism works. We have atmospheric pressure outside. We have a dam wall being our glottis. And then we have the pressure in the thoracic cavity, or the intrapleural pressure, specifically the pressure inside the lungs. And then we also have the abdominal pressure that is occurring below the level of the diaphragm. And what happens is the atmospheric pressure is obviously a constant pressure. It doesn't change, particularly if we're at sea level. If we elevate above sea level, it might be different. But the atmospheric pressure never really changes. So what changes relative to the atmospheric pressure is the intrapleural pressure. So the pressure inside the lungs is what is changing, and the pressure change occurs from the relative position of the thoracic cavity. And one of the key drivers of that is the diaphragm descending and ascending in that cavity. Again, once the diaphragm ascends and presses up, cavity space decreases, pressure increases against the glottis, the dam wall. If it increases to a point that it is higher than the atmospheric pressure, when the dam wall is removed, the air actually expels, and we expel the air into the atmosphere. And that is how we breathe out. The opposite occurs when we breathe in. The diaphragm begins to descend. We get a drop in pressure inside the thoracic cavity and inside the lungs. When the dam wall opens, the higher atmospheric pressure now brings air into the lungs, and that's how we get gas exchange. So it's dependent on the shape and size of the thoracic cavity. And again, the thoracic cavity is above the level of the diaphragm. I've just chinned myself with some ribs. Never thought I would say that, but that actually kind of hurt. The thoracic cavity is above the level of the diaphragm, so inside the rib cage. That actually kind of clipped my lip. So the breathing mechanism, thoracic pressure change, positive or negative, pressure inside here, either increasing or decreasing, is dependent on the change in the size and shape of the internal cavity of the thoracic cavity. There's two main ways that this changes shape. Number one, as we've discussed, is the diaphragm descending and ascending. When it ascends, the space is decreased. When we descend, the space is increased. So that is one main way that we can actually change the shape of and the size of the intrathoracic cavity. The second one is the actual rib cage mechanics. So we're going to break out the rib cage mechanics here. Diaphragm function, as we've discussed, this is just a little bit of a recap for that. Breathing in, we get descension of the diaphragm. Diaphragm drops down. Let me make myself bigger here. Let's see what I can do. Woo! When the diaphragm descends, when we breathe in, intra-rib space increases, which means the pressure decreases. That's step 2 and step 3. And that pressure decrease means the air flows into the lungs. Breathing out is the opposite of that. Breathing out, the diaphragm ascends up into the ribcage space. That then increases the pressure by decreasing the available space. And as a result of that increase in pressure, air now flows out of the lungs. And that is how the diaphragm affects the available space of the rib cage. What does that look like? We went through this in the previous video, but this is that ascension and descension. Breathing in, breathing out. This is what it looks like on a forced inspiration. Breathing in, we get a big drop down, and we can actually see this space increase, and that's what's drawing air in. This is a really cool MRI, one of my favorite videos. But it shows that descension of the diaphragm comes down and air is funneled into this system here. And both the left and the right hand sides of the ventral cavity, of the thoracic cavity, actually are going to expand with the air as it comes in. So that's the first mechanism that really drives inspiration and expiration to change the shape of the internal thoracic cavity. The second one is the ribs themselves. So we need to look at the rib cage mechanics and how they move, because they are designed to move. They should move. Belly breathing is a hoax. The rib cage is designed to move. Let it move. So we have 12 total ribs. These ribs attach to the 12 thoracic vertebra. We have the ribs attach into the vertebra on the backhand side here through 2 junctions. We have the costovertebral junction, which is directly into the facet inside inside the vertebra. And then we have the costotransverso, which is actually the transverse process of the rib cage, the vertebra, the lateral aspects of the vertebra. Some of the ribs have a direct attachment into the transverse process as well, and that would be called the costotransverso joint. So we have attachments into the actual vertebral body and then also into the transverse process on the vertebra. The reason we have a rib cage is to protect the internal organs inside there, as we discussed in the physiology anatomy based stuff. We have 3 sort of classifications of ribs. Number 1, we have the true ribs. The true ribs are the first 7 in most people. And that is a direct attachment to the manubrium or the sternum. So here we can see ribs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then this 7th one also has a direct attachment. They attach straight into the manubrium and the sternum, and they are called the true ribs. We then have the false ribs, which are ribs 8, 9, and 10, and these actually attach to the sternum through their superior cartilage of the rib above them. So superior rib, the rib above them, through the cartilage there. So 10 attaches through 9, which attaches through 8, which attaches through 7 into the sternum. And we can see that here on this model. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 8, 9, and 10 down here, they actually attach up into the superior rib before attaching straight into the sternum. So what we know, there's also, the floating ribs, which are the ribs attaching to vertebra T11 and T12, and they have no attachment. They just act like 2 little springy ribs on the backside here with no attachment anywhere. They're actually not even visible, like they're not an anatomy feature in like 30 or 40%. I can't remember the exact stat of humans. So I think these things are on the way out, and they probably won't be there in the next 1,000 years as our evolution continues. We no longer need to protect the backside of our body like we used to. So what we learnt in regards to stability, and we'll unpack that more in the coming weeks now that we have the base level, we know that joint stability is a result of 3 factors. For a fun game, pause the video. What are the 3 factors? Pause. The 3 factors for joint stability are active restraints, so the muscular system, passive restraints being connective tissues and ligaments, these guys, this connective tissue here, and then also the bone formation, the osseous formation. So let's unpack how that affects rib cage stability here. We have the 7, again, I'm going to make this bigger. Why the fuck not? So we have the 7 true ribs, which have a direct attachment into the sternum, which means that those ribs are probably going to be a little bit more stable than these false ribs down below of this rib cage. Our rib cage doesn't move this much, but the false ribs that have a cartilaginous attachment to the superior rib are going to be more mobile as a result of that compared to the 7 true ribs up above. If that makes sense, because that is what actually drives joint stability. That passive restraint is one of the key factors, and that is why the true ribs, ribs 1 through 7, function slightly different to the false ribs, ribs 10, 11, and 12. The last thing that we need to understand, and this model doesn't do it well, but there is a downslope from posterior to anterior direction of our rib cage. It's actually slightly down, and I guess when I give this thing a bit of a thoracic curvature, we actually get that downslope, but we have a downslope from posterior to anterior, and that is important when we discuss the pump handle action of the ribs. So now that we understand the anatomy of the ribs, how does it actually change shape? What forces the rib cage to change shape? Because again, that shape change is required to change the pressure, and then the pressure change is what drives into inspiration and expiration of gas exchange. We have 2 main mechanisms that the rib cage works with in terms of movement. We have a pump handle action here, which is the sternum moving superior, forward, and up. And then we also have the bucket handle action, which is the lateral and anterior movement, so lateral being out to the side, anterior being forward of the false ribs down below. And when we discussed the function of the ribs, the anatomy of the ribs, ribs 1 through 7, because of the direct pull of the sternum forward and up on inspiration, that pump handle action, those 7 ribs are the ones that are going to drive into an anterior superior movement. Whereas the false ribs, the ribs down below that are a little bit more mobile, these ones are going to be the ones that wing out and forward upon bucket handle action, where we actually get that bucket handle movement occurring and swinging the ribs up and out throughout that movement. So the ribs move through those mechanisms. We have pump handle action, which is forward and out. And then we have bucket handle action, which is lateral and forward. And that is how the rib cage itself gets bigger on inspiration and smaller on expiration. And that's how we get the shape change. And that shape change is what drives the pressure either increase or decrease. What that is called is internal and external rotation of the ribs. Internal rotation is the rib cage coming down, the bucket handle coming in, the pump handle coming down. That is what occurs on expiration. We get an internal rotation of the ribs. Then on inspiration, I don't know if I said inspiration or expiration there, expiration draws internal rotation. Inhalation draws external rotation, where the ribs open up and fan and flare out. Both of these movements, internal and external rotation, are independent of lumbar and thoracic spine motion. It doesn't need to change the shape of the spine in order to change the shape of the rib cage. We don't need to extend in order to inhale, and we don't need to flex in order to exhale. And that is something that's really, really important when we talk about breathing drills. We want the rib cage to be going into internal rotation, independent of spinal flexion and extension. internal and external rotation. This movement occurs at the costovertebral and costotransverso joints, the joints of the ribs attaching to the vertebra, not the vertebra themselves. The movement occurs at the ribs, not the spine. We need to dissociate that. Video showing I've been doing that non-stop. But again, internal rotation is rib cage coming down. So pump handle down, bucket handle down. External rotation is rib cage opening up. Pump handle up, bucket handle up. So let's discuss accessory breathing muscles. And this is a bit of a misconception. I don't believe there are really accessory breathing muscles. There are muscles that can help. They're not accessory though. They're designed to help. So I don't think they're accessory. I don't think we can draw the line of which ones are accessory and which ones are non-accessory. I like to draw the line as diaphragm favored breathing versus non-diaphragmatic breathing. The key ones that most people talk about and the ones that we'll unpack here, we have the neck muscles, the scalenes and the SCM, sternocleidomastoid, that sits here on the lateral sides, and then the scalenes, which is a little bit deeper in the cervical spine down into the first and second rib. We have the pec minor, which sits on the anterior portion of the rib cage, and then we have the lats and the QLs, the big muscles on the posterior side of the thorax. However, with our new understanding of the rib cage mechanics and breathing being a result of shape change within the rib cage, does that not mean that any muscle that attaches to the rib cage would be able to change the shape in either inspiration and expansion or compression and expiration? And I think that's really true. Any muscle that attaches to this thing can alter the shape, which means it has effect on breathing. And we will see any muscle that is attaching to this or the scapula, because the scapula attaches to this as well, changing the shape of the rib cage. And if the rib cage changes shape, we get gas exchange. And if we get gas exchange, we have an influence on breathing. So I personally don't think that we can consider any of these muscles accessory breathing muscles. They are breathing muscles. They're just not the diaphragm. And that's where I draw the line. It's diaphragmatic breathing or non-diaphragmatic breathing. They're not accessory or whatever. They all help. Let's unpack then some of the specifics of why they're designed to help. So the first action of the rib cage is the pump handle action. And that is the pump handle moving anterior and superior. We're bringing the downsloping ribs to a more neutral position in that mechanism. So that is the ribs moving forward and out. What pulls ribs forward and out other than air changes on the inside? So we discussed the SCMs being the sternocleidomastoid, which is this muscle here that wraps sort of laterally around the neck. And then we have the scalenes that attach into the first and second rib in the lateral portions here and here. So let's talk about the scalenes first. If I have two muscles here that are going to pull up on the rib cage, that is actually going to be creating that pump handle action. If I have two muscles here that are pulling up on the ribs, that is going to create that pump handle action. That makes a lot of sense. It's designed to help with breathing. The same thing happens with the SCM. The SCM comes in and inserts into sort of the manubrium first rib. We can see that attachment here. That is going to do the same thing. If the neck muscles are overactive in breathing, we are going to get that aiding in that pump handle action. They're actually pulling superiorly on the rib cage, on those first and second ribs, and the manubrium, on the true ribs, on the pump handle. The next thing that we have to look at is the pec minor, and everyone's like, oh yeah, like he's a neck and chest breather. It's all happening here. Well, that is for a reason. The pec minor, which attaches to ribs 3, 4, and 5, ribs 3, 4, and 5, true ribs. If the pec minor, is active in breathing, that is also going to help leverage the pump handle action that is occurring during inspiration and expiration. The pec minor attaches to 3, 4, and 5. The scalenes attach to 1 and 2. So through the neck and through the pec minor, we get the first 5 of 7 true ribs aiding in that pump handle action. So they are designed to help us breathe. So why would we call them accessory breathing muscles when really they are breathing muscles? So let's now discuss the bucket handle action. The bucket handle action is lateral and anterior movement of the rib cage. So it's forward and out of the false ribs. The false ribs being 10, 9, and 8. Forward and out. Typically what we'll see is that is when we get an extension moment through the spine and through the thorax, where we extend forward and out. And that makes, again, a lot of sense why the lats and the QLs would aid in that motion. If we extend the spine, we actually get a relative change of the lower part of the thorax. By extending the spine, we actually increase the available space. And by increasing the space, we get a decrease in pressure. By decreasing the pressure, we get air in. So the lumbar erectors, lats, QLs, whatever's on the back side of the body, can actually force change in shape of the rib cage to actually get gas exchange to occur as well. So are they accessory breathing muscles, or are they just breathing muscles that can aid in respiration? I think it's the latter. They're not really accessory breathing muscles. So all of these muscles that attach on the rib cage can affect the shape change of this thing in some capacity. And we're sort of getting into the tensegrity model of human movement now, but we'll discuss that later. I've already done that as well. Fantastic. So as I said, I like to draw the line as diaphragmatic breathing versus non-diaphragmatic breathing. I don't think that any of them can be classified as primary or secondary muscles. It's just we get some added benefits to the super system when the diaphragm allows best leverage to action. By increasing diaphragm function or action, we will see a decrease in accessory breathing tonicity. And again, it's accessory. It's not really accessory. Some of those added muscles, the pec minor on 3, 4, and 5 are the scalenes. Let's use them as an example. If we increase this guy doing the job, these things no longer need to do the job of the pump handle. And if they don't need to do the job of the pump handle, they're going to eccentrically orient. And if they eccentrically orient, it means that they're going to allow range of motion more so in their extremities. So we'll get increased neck range of motion. We'll also get increased glenohumeral and scapular movement as a result of decreasing the tonicity of these muscles. The same thing happens on the lower back with the lats and the QLs. If we increase the tonicity of the diaphragm or leverage it better for movement and actual breathing function, we will then get a decrease in tonicity and eccentric orientation of those muscle fibers. And eccentric orientation means that we then will have greater range of motion presenting. So eccentric orientation of these accessory breathing muscles increase the range of motion at the shoulder and the hips, the neck, everywhere in the body. This is one of the reasons why breathing drills work. We also have a couple of things here describing how diaphragmatic positional breathing actually increases parasympathetic drive in the system. As we discussed last week in respiration physiology, that means that we can actually upregulate recovery and all that sort of stuff. So it's really, really beneficial on a number of things to get the diaphragm leverage for better and greater inspiration and expiration mechanics. So how do we breathe with the diaphragm? It's not belly breathing. Belly breathing is a hoax, as I've discussed now. This thing needs to change shape. If this thing's not changing shape and we're restricting it and trying to just get forward anterior movement of the belly, that's not actually what diaphragmatic breathing is. Diaphragmatic breathing is the descension and ascension of the diaphragm with pump handle and bucket handle actions occurring. We should see a circumferential expansion of the entire ventral cavity. And we'll discuss that when we get into breathing drills. However, there's two main strategies that we have to leverage the diaphragm better. Number one, simply just breathe through the nose. Slow the process down. By slowing the process down, we allow more time for the diaphragm to descend. We actually saw this in this case study here. Have a look at that. It's in the learning resources. But easiest way is just to slow your breathing rate and actually change to a nasal breathing capacity. In and out through the nose, slow everything down, allow better leverage time for the diaphragm to descend. The second one is we need to understand what the zone of apposition is, and then we need to increase the zone of apposition. So what is the zone of apposition? The zone of apposition is the distance from the insertion point, so at the front of the rib cage here, the distance of that in a vertical manner up to the top of the dome of the diaphragm. So this distance here to here is the zone of apposition. You can see here that this guy in the middle has a far greater distance for that diaphragm to descend down into compared to this guy over here who's got his rib cage flared out and open. He's slightly more extended. His rib cage is forward, and that has actually caused the zone of apposition to descend, which means the diaphragm can't descend as far as this. So this has a greater zone of apposition when compared to this. This is what we need to prioritize to cause diaphragmatic breathing, not belly breathing. A couple of key things here, just so we're aware of the anatomy of it. After a forced expiration, so once we get all the air out and the cupola, the domes of the diaphragm drive up into the thoracic cavity, the right cupola is in level with the fourth costal cartilage. So the right cupola comes up to about this level on the right-hand side. And the left side is down around the fifth and sixth. So the right-hand side is up higher, as we discussed, there's asymmetries. And the left-hand side is slightly lower than that. When the body is erect, so when we're standing up tall, the dome of the diaphragm actually begins to descend. And that is because the ribs have started to bucket handle and pump handle. They've started to flare out. And that reduces the diaphragm's respiratory moments become smaller. That is this explained. When we stand upright and flare the ribs, we've actually caused a slight descension of the diaphragm. And that means that by standing up tall with the ribs flared, we're not going to get as great a diaphragm ascension and descension. And that is going to mean that the accessory breathing muscles, quote unquote accessory, when really they are breathing muscles, those supplementary movements and muscles are going to occur because of the inability for the diaphragm to now descend and ascend. The fantastic thing with this is it got looked at in terms of recovery rates from the typical footballer, don't show any weakness, hands over the head, compared to hunched over in all fours on your knees, the effect of the recovery postures during high-intensity interval training. If anybody that has gone through high-intensity interval training, this is all you want to do. You want to hunch over, you want to crunch down. This feels very restrictive, and now we're starting to understand why. The beauty with this is this position showed an increase in tidal volume, meaning we were getting greater amounts of gas exchange occurring per breath. We actually had an improved heart rate recovery. So the heart rate dropped quicker and lower and faster within the 60-second time frame, I believe they used. And we also had a higher VCO2. So the volume of expired central carbon dioxide, was actually greater in the hunched over position. And these three things working together tells us that the recovery of this position is far greater. And part of that, only one part of that, but part of that is because we've leveraged the diaphragm to actually, we've created a zone of apposition. And that zone of apposition has allowed that movement to occur, which means we get greater amounts of tidal volume, gas exchange occurring, and we can actually recover a whole lot better. So this is a really cool study to look at.